Hi everybody, this is the Baseball Hut, the amazing, spectacular, terrific, the great one, the People's Champion, your host, the Hut, and welcome back to the Baseball Hut 2. I hope you like this video and subscribe. So we're going to talk about the New York Yankees. They lost again to the Brewers, to the Milwaukee Brewers, the first place Milwaukee Brewers. And they're currently 70 and 72 in last place, or in fifth place, whatever you want to call it, in the American League East. So right now they had sort of a 5-game winning streak led by the Martian Jason Dominguez, and but they've sort of now they're going up against a really good team. The Brewers are really good. We're going to talk about them, what they need to do to be more like the '98 Yankees. The '98 Yankees had their big, ceremony at Old Timers Day. They made a big deal out of it because it's the 25th anniversary of that team. I think they're going to have like a big ceremony in a couple of weeks or next week or whatever with the whole team. On a separate note, we mentioned about the game today. There was a rain delay between the Old Timers Day and the game. There was very few people at the end of that game for the Yankees. It tells you how far this franchise has fallen over the last really the last year, even really the last calendar year. Because really since that great start they had last year, they've been a mediocre club. But they have a lot of work to do if they want to be like the '98 Yankees. The '98 Yankees were 114 and 48. One of the highest win totals in the last 60 years. One of the highest win totals in the last 60 years. They finished in first. They won the World Series. I would mention that they were down 2-0 to the Cleveland Indians in the ALCS, but they came back and won, and they swept the San Diego Padres. The San Diego Padres that was led by Tony Gwynn, Ken Caminiti, Trevor Hoffman, and a few other guys that you know of very well. But that team, just to sort of go back to that team, that New York Yankee team, they had some really all-time players on that team. Derek Jeter, Bernie Williams, Mariano Rivera, who I believe is the single reason the Yankees won all those championships in the 90s and in 2000s because of Mariano Rivera. I was very surprised to go through his numbers for that year. That year he was 3-0 with a 1.91 ERA. But the interesting thing I thought was interesting with 36 saves was that in 61 and a third innings, he only struck 36 batters. I was shocked to see that number. Shocked. Because you think of him, you think of a lot of strikeouts, but he didn't strike out a lot of batters. It tells you how good of a defense that team had. When you win 114 games, that team, when you win that many games, you do everything right. They had several guys that had a lot of RBIs. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 guys over 90 RBIs. Amazing. Tino Martinez, 123 RBIs. A very strong left-handed presence in that lineup. You had guys like Tino Martinez, Bernie Williams, who was the center fielder and a switch hitter, Paul O'Neill, the 3-hitter on that team, Darryl Strawberry was a DH on that team. You had guys that were real legendary players. Darryl Strawberry was a legendary player here with the Mets and just in baseball. And he was sort of a role player on that team. And Tim Raines was on the bench. He's a Hall of Famer with the Expos. He was one of the great players in the National League. He was the poor man's version of Rickey Henderson, and he was on the bench for that team. And you had guys on that team that were all-stars, really excellent players at their position. Jorge Posada was an excellent player in his day. He wasn't the best catcher in baseball. Certainly wasn't the best catcher in town. We know who the best catcher in baseball in town was. That was Mike Piazza. But he was there. Derek Jeter with over 3,000 hits. He was one of the top 5 great shortstops in the history of the game. And, of course, Bernie Williams, one of the great center fielders in the history of the Yankees. Paul O'Neill, one of the great 3-hitters in the history of the Yankees. But that strong left-handed presence, just to sort of talk about the Yankees of today. Who was the strong left-handed presence on the Yankees? Can't think of any. You have, the closest guy you have is Anthony Rizzo. And Anthony Rizzo is obviously out for the rest of the season due to getting a concussion in May, and they didn't diagnose it properly. And he is the only guy that's really of any note that's a left-handed hitter on this Yankee team, on this Yankee offense. And if the Yankees are going to be any good, they've got to improve the middle of that order. And that is the one thing that, just as a Mets fan and just as a baseball fan, they're never going to beat the Astros. Because that's been their sort of, thing that's been in their way all these years, is that they're never going to be able to do that if they don't have more balance in that lineup. They're too heavily right-handed. And if you're heavily right-handed, especially with that short porch in Yankee Stadium, you're not going to win. You go and you do the formula that makes you a great team. And the Yankees have not done that. Brian Cashman, the general manager, has not done that. And obviously their bench isn't good. Yankee bench is terrible. And you have role players on, just going back to the 98 team, you had role players that played big roles. Scott Brocious was a role player. He was an everyday player on that Yankee team, but he was a role player, and that you didn't expect, and that's why he had so many big hits in the World Series and so many big moments during his career with the Yankees. Now the pitching. Let's get to the pitching of that old Yankee team in the 90s. They had Andy Pettitte. Andy Pettitte is really the last homegrown Yankee in terms of as a starter of any note that is not a middling guy like they've been developing over the last few years, like Luis Severino, Domingo Germán. Andy Pettitte was a big winner. He won a lot of games with the Yankees and won a lot of games in the majors. And that's a guy that was on that team, but they developed him. They started him in 95, and he was with the Yankees for a long time, and then he went to the Astros, went back to the Yankees. But this was a guy that was very much a homegrown guy and a lefty. Yankees don't have a dominant lefty. Nestor Cortes, I hate to be mean, but he is a guy that is he's a journeyman. He had a good year last year, and now he's dealing with injuries. We'll see if he's able to bounce back next year, but do not pencil him in as your number 2 starter. You just have to get a strong left-handed presence out of that pitching staff. Very important. I mean, just look at the old Yankee team that David Wells, who was 18-4 that year. David Cone, 20-7 in 1998. He should have got more looks at by the media in terms of the Hall of Fame. He got very little look at. They didn't look at him long enough. He should have gotten a lot closer look, because he was one of the great all-time right-handed pitchers of the last, since 1988. So you're talking about, he's up there with Mike Mussina. Mike Mussina became a Hall of Famer. There's no reason that David Cone should not have gotten a longer look on the ballot. You had, believe it or not, Hideki Arabu. Remember him? An import from another place, and obviously the biggest import that the Yankees brought in, and one of the big winners in World Series history and postseason history, is Orlando El Duque Hernandez. So when you have this kind of a pitching staff, and that was, I think, El Duque's first year in the majors, you have these guys here at the back end of your rotation. It's going to be very difficult to go up against them. And then you had Rivera at the back end of the bullpen with Ramiro Mendoza, who was their long man, spot started. Then you had Mike Stanton out there, who didn't have a good year that year. But you had Jeff Nelson, who was a really good reliever with them for a long time. And Graham Lloyd, the Australian. And this Yankee team, their bullpen is terrible. I don't care how hard this team throws. Does anybody have any confidence in Clay Holmes? Every time I watch him, he gives up. Remember that game against the Marlins a few weeks ago? Where he blew the game? Terrible. They had a 4-run lead, 5-run lead, and he blew it. Blew it! And Wandy Peralta, none of these guys could be in that bullpen today. And there's really only one pitcher on that team that could be on that Yankee staff, and that's Jarrett Cole. The rest of these guys in this rotation, the bullpen, would never be able to be on the Yankees in 98. I know one thing, George would not put up with any kind of nonsense, even back then, even though he calmed down a lot at the end. He would not have put up with the kind of bad performance by some of these guys. And really, there's only one player that could be worthy of being on the Yankees, and that's Aaron Judge. But like I've been talking about, Aaron Judge has an issue. He can't stay healthy. And until he masters that, I don't think he's going to be able to. So this team, what are the big keys they need to do? They need to get more left-handed rotation. They need to develop more pitching in the rotation. And they need a big left-handed presence in this lineup. They need at least 2 or 3 guys that are going to be left-handed, that are going to be strong with left-handed bats. Because if I'm looking at Baseball Reference, there is not one guy that's left-handed other than Anthony Rizzo. Osvaldo Cabrera is a switch hitter. He hit 207. Anthony Volpe, 214. Gleyber Torres, right-handed hitter. DJ LeMahieu, right-handed hitter. Giancarlo Stanton, right-handed hitter. There's no left-handed presence here. Until they make those corrections and they go back to who they are, they're not going to be able to get at it their own way. So let me know what you think about this video. Of course, please subscribe to the Baseball 2. Thank you, and I'll see you later.